Radio 4, in 25 minutes, Kaleidoscope and Leonard Bernstein as you've never heard him before. Before that, here's Derek Cooper with the food programme.
1, 2, 3.
Hello. Today in Nicaragua, they're harvesting their key export crop, coffee. There's a war on, and it's not easy. To help with the picking, volunteers have flown in from all over the world. For the first time, a small contingent from Britain has joined them, and after a long day in the fields, they still found enough voice to record a solidarity song for the food programme.
In 1649, to St. George's Hill, a ragged band they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlord, they defied the law. They were the dispossessed, reclaiming what was theirs. We come in peace, they said.
Every sack of coffee that can be brought peacefully out of the mountains means more equipment for Nicaragua's schools and hospitals, new tractors for the cooperatives, and spare parts for the buses, the lorries and factories which will keep the economy ticking over. Last season, 200 pickers were killed in attacks by rebel Contras, and 15% of the harvest went unpicked. Some pickers have been killed this year, but if the harvest goes well, the government hopes to earn $150 million in much-needed hard currency. Tim Kuhn is in Nicaragua, and he's been to the northern mountains to an Upe, a state-owned coffee farm near Matagalpa. He talked to Viv Lewis, who runs her own farm back here in Cumbria, and Brian McSheeny, who'd been out on the hillside picking for several days.
Good enough to offload into the bag?
Yes, I've got a full basket here.
Right. So there we go.
Tim Kuhn interrupted the picking and asked them whether they weren't afraid of being attacked by the rebels.
We're, of course, not in nearly as dangerous a zone as the majority of the Nicaraguan volunteer pickers. The Nicaraguan government has been very clear that our safety is a paramount concern of theirs, not only because that would give them very bad news value if the internationalists were harmed by the Contras, but also because they generally care for our safety. We are here to pick coffee. We are not here to fight their war, although we support them in their struggle to maintain their independence.
You see you're carrying one of these small basket here, and as you take the beans, you put them into the basket. But what in particular, what type of beans do you have to pick?
Well, I'm standing at a coffee tree. It's about 9 feet high. We have to pick all the red berries, any brown ones, and the ones which are mainly red. We mustn't pick green ones because the husk won't come off them. And we're trying to be very careful about picking because we want to pick the best quality coffee. You start at the bottom of the tree and work your way up, and you have to bend the branches down because they're pretty high. I would say about 1/3 to half of the berries get picked on each tree. There's 3 pickings. We're on the first picking.
And what is the next process? After they are picked and you fill your basket, what happens next?
Well, the basket then goes into a sack, and then we can take it down to the Upe, and they weigh it. They then get tipped into this big sort of concrete reception place, and then they get dehusked and washed. So you end up with the white beans, which then get put on trays to dry and get taken down to Matagalpa, where they get processed.
Yes, they get roasted down in Matagalpa. It's a big roasting station for a lot of the coffee production areas around here. And once they are roasted, of course, then they're available for sale. It's lucky for the Nicaraguans that their quota from the International Coffee Organization is quite a good one this year, and that coincides with a good price and a hoped-for good crop, since many of the other staple crops, both for providing the food for the Nicaraguan people and for providing foreign exchange, have not done so well this year. So the coffee really is very critical and very crucial to the continuing good success of what the Nicaraguans are trying to do here for their people.
And what time of day do you start picking?
Well, we get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, have breakfast, and we aim to start picking by 6. We carry on picking till about 12. Then we have half an hour for lunch, and then go on picking till 3:30, and then the time after that's our own. It gets hot after 12, but it's really nice getting up early in the morning and going down there. It's beautiful.
And what are your living conditions like and the food?
pretty basic, but I mean, they're okay. I mean, the food is rice, beans and tortillas 3 times a day, but they're really delicious. We're really growing to like it. I think I shall eat it when I get home.
Nicaraguan ground and instant coffee is imported into Britain by the Tyneside-based company Tradecraft as part of its campaign to increase public awareness of the country's political and economic predicament. They refuse to import the beans because they believe we should be encouraging developing countries to add value to their raw materials by doing their own processing. There are 2 main kinds of coffee: Robusta, which is grown mostly in Indonesia and Africa, a strong bean, which has twice as much caffeine as the better quality and more flavoured Arabica. It is Arabica which is grown in Nicaragua. So what does a good sample taste like?
For Nicaragua, it is in very good quality. It has this a rather amount of acidity, and it has a lack of body.
And to compensate for lack of body, you would add Robusta. Now that was Jan van der Bilt, chief taster for the Dutch firm of Douwe Egberts, which has been blending and roasting coffee for 230 years. At their factory in Utrecht, they produce 1 million packages of ground coffee a day. Although we are still largely a nation of tea drinkers, we have begun to drink more and more fresh coffee, 20% more last year, and sales will rise again this year. But prices are rising too. The drought in Brazil could halve the 1986 crop, and this has led to panic buying, and coffee has reached its highest price level for 6 years. Brazil accounts for nearly 1/3 of world coffee, and there are fears that the coffee trees could take years to recover from the drought. The International Coffee Organization, which increases or decreases the amount of coffee they make available for export to keep prices stable, are meeting to decide whether to suspend their quota system. And that, of course, would put more coffee on the market and bring prices down. Now, all this poses great problems for firms like Douwe Egberts. They keep roughly 6 weeks' supply of green beans in their warehouses, beans which come from up to 25 different countries. As we drove through the factory gates in Utrecht, a marvellous aroma of roasting Arabica engulfed us. It was rather like visiting a gigantic coffee pot. Huge lorries were rolling in from Hamburg, Rotterdam and Antwerp, and unloading their 60-kilo bags of green beans onto forklift trucks. The coffee bean is a very delicate thing, and on the long sea journey from the Americas or Africa, it's got to be handled carefully.
It's very important that during the transport of the green coffee that you have good conditions. When you have strange goods on the ship, and it is possible that the off flavors goes over this to the coffee beans, and that will give this an off taste, and that's very bad for the coffee. And for that reason, that each lot of coffee which arrive here, we sampled and we roasted and we tested, and when there is something wrong, then we refuse to accept.
What about coffee beans that have been grown with too high percentage of artificial fertilizer in them?
It could be that you will get an off taste on the coffee.
What do you do with beans like that?
We try this to refuse these lots of coffee. And when that's impossible, then we try this to use this coffee with a very small percentage in a special blend.
So you spread it out?
Spread it out, yes.
After sampling, the beans are cleaned and pneumatically pumped to their storage silos. Then they're blended before being fed into the huge roasting machines, which produce 60,000 tons of coffee a year. Responsible for the blends which are exported to the UK is Rien Vermeulen.
The temperature we use is quite high. We go up to about 225 degrees centigrade. Coffee roasting takes about 4 minutes in this particular case. If you roast the coffee on a small scale, say in a shop, because you haven't got enough temperature, it takes you a long time to actually come to the right degree of roasting. That we call over roasting, and it gives an off taste to the coffee. You almost roast out all the flavor of the coffee. This is one of our coffee grinders. As you can see, we've got 2 large metal rolls in between which the coffee is actually quenched and ground at quite a high speed, and the distance between the 2 rolls determines how fine you want to grind the coffee. And in this case it is filter fine grind, so the fine grind.
Once the coffee is ground, it begins to dissipate its aromas, so it's important to vacuum pack it almost immediately. Unopened, it'll keep without deteriorating for up to 10 months. Meanwhile, up in his laboratory, Jan van der Bilt is creating, with a small sample of beans, the large-scale automated process that's going on down in the factory. His roaster is small enough to go on a tabletop, but the principle is the same.
With this, I can regulate here just the gas flame. You see, I switch on this. And now I start heating just the drum. And when we now put on the green coffee, and then we put it so in the drum. And it takes about now 5 to 6 minutes before the coffee is brown. Direct after the roasting process, we start with cooling. Then we take this small scale and we put the coffee here. The rest of the silver skins, which are around the beans, we take away just by doing this, and then by doing so, and by blowing a little bit. Now, and what you see then at the end, it is a nice roasted product.
So when you roast a bean, what chemical and physical changes take place in it?
The main change you have is that you transport just the sugar content and caramel. And when you caramelize the coffee, also you create the aromas. And the aromas you need for the sensation. When you have a coffee without aroma, you have no sensation. Dus when you have a package of coffee and when you open it, and when you first contact it is, fantastic. Now that you have this to create during the roasting process. We can do somewhat with blending, we can do somewhat with the degree of roast, and we can do somewhat with the time of roasting.
Can you tell by looking at these samples of the roasted beans what they might taste like, or is that impossible?
That's not impossible. When you have a somewhat oily bean, then you know that you have to do with better beans. When it is a somewhat rough surface, then you have to do with a somewhat lower quality. And I can show you. This is a coffee from Sierra Leone. This is a Robusta. And then we take...
That's the Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone. And then we take a coffee from Zimbabwe. And when you take it between your fingers, you can feel that the surface of this coffee is somewhat... Oilier.
Yes.
Yes, now.
So this has got more aromatics.
There's more aromatics, yeah. And then you have to do with better qualities. This the higher the amount.
And you would pay more for that.
And you have to pay a higher price, yeah.
And what price discrepancy is there between the very cheapest beans and the most expensive? Double?
No,
treble?
that depends on the moment. What's on this moment is our big problem. That is with the Brazil coffee. And that has to do with the drought which we have on this moment in Brazil. We are looking just to other countries to try to get our quantities and our qualities. And that is rather difficult, and we have to find this a solution by making another blend.
And what for you is the greatest coffee in the world?
On this moment, Kenya and Zimbabwe. That's for me on the top. And sometimes...
Better than Blue Mountain or Java or...
No, that depends on the moment of the year. When you have this fresh Blue Mountains, it could be that you have a very high quality. But when you have this past crop or old crop, then you have a lack of aroma. And for that reason, for me, is not the name important, but the intrinsic value of the coffee. That's for me important.
Well, in front of us are some, 22 white earthenware coffee pots, and inside them, they all have hot coffee.
Hot coffee.
Now, this is for your tasting.
This is for our tasting, yes. I've taken a small cup of coffee. So, and then I take a sip. And then I spit it out. This coffee is full-bodied, has a less aroma, and it is just a little bit sweet and a little bit rough ordinary. Also, you can join me. Try.
This one?
This one or this one. That's
This one.
better. There's a big slurp. Ooh.
Oh, all over my shirt.
That's the profession.
How long? Oh, dear. How long,
10 years.
how long does it take before you can spit coffee? Right. No,
Okay, sorry.
Yes, didn't
I
get
had-
much out of that.
Yeah.
What should I have got out of that?
But what you have tested now, that's Uganda coffee.
I've now got a Uganda coloured shirt, actually.
And when you take this coffee,
That's it. Not a drop over your jumper.
no.
A major breakthrough on the laundry front. Well, just as there are different teas for different times of the day, so there are breakfast coffees, mid-morning coffees, and strong after-dinner coffee. It all depends on the blend of the beans and the quality of the roast. For Britain, Jan selects a coffee high in aroma because, as a nation of instant coffee drinkers, most people only make real coffee as a treat when they've got people in for a meal. When I buy coffee, I buy the beans and grind them in an electric machine. But this may be counterproductive. The heat generated in some types of grinders apparently can impair the flavour. Working for a firm which specialises in selling ground coffee, Rien Vermeulen naturally thinks that that's the best way to buy it.
The advantage of that is that the factory is able to grind the coffee evenly. At the same time, the factory will pack the coffee vacuum in a hard vacuum brick pack, which is the best way to conserve the quality and the volatile aromas in that coffee.
But of course, the minute you open the vacuum pack, it begins to deteriorate.
Yes, you can prevent that by using the amount of coffee you require, then not to empty the contents into a storage container, and that's what a lot of people do, but to fold back the seal of the pack, then to put the whole pack into an airtight container and put that container in the fridge, which will keep the coffee relatively fresh for a period of 10-14 days.
Supposing you've got your own grinder, and what's the best way to keep beans?
A very good way to keep the beans is to use the amount you require and put the rest in the freezer. Because of the oil in coffee, the coffee won't become a solid rock. The beans stay loose, so the use is quite easy thereafter.
I suppose we really came to coffee through instant coffee, and connoisseurs of coffee would say that that is not the best way to come to it. Are we drinking more real coffee these days?
Yes, we definitely are. In the last 5 years, the use of ground coffee has taken an enormous step forward. The market is increasing dramatically, particularly by the introduction of the filter machine. And we expect this tendency to continue over the next few years, and the more traditional use of the percolator coffee will gradually disappear.
Well, you've got some coffee machines over here. Let's
Yes, I'll show you one of
Have a
the
look.
filter machines. Now, a filter machine basically consists of a boiler, which heats the water, a container in which you pour the cold water from the tap, a filter cone with the filter paper inside, and a jug underneath. Now, what you do, simply fill the water container with the amount of cups you want to make. So let's say 6. Then you pour in to the filter paper bag, which is sitting in the filter cone, the amount of coffee, 4 or 5 cups. You simply switch it on, and within 2 minutes a cup of coffee will be made, and the heating plate underneath the jug will make sure that the coffee is kept at the right temperature, because if you take only 2 cups, the remainder 3 cups would otherwise get cold. Now,
So it's completely simple.
it's very simple and foolproof.
Now, what other methods are there?
Now, here we have a percolator, a more traditional percolator machine. You pour
And
in,
that's electrically heated too.
yes, pour in the water, again, for the required number of cups, the coffee in here, and when you switch it on, the water will start to boil through the coffee, and that will give the bitter aftertaste to the coffee.
But that's boiling the coffee.
Yes.
Oh, mm.
And that is the worst you can do to
Okay.
coffee.
So you don't approve of that?
No.
What about making coffee with something that doesn't cost you a penny? Because all this equipment is fairly expensive, isn't it?
Then you take a porcelain pot, you put some medium ground coffee in, pour on the hot water, leave it for a while to infuse, then pour the coffee into a cup. Of course, you will have to use a strainer, because otherwise you get the grounds into the cup.
Because you could make it in a teapot.
You could, but that's not to be advised, because the coffee will leave some taste in your teapot. And therefore you should always keep your teapot and your coffee pot well separated from one another.
However you make it or however you take it, fresh or instant, coffee has been getting rather a bad press in recent years. Does it really give people insomnia? Is it bad for the heart? Does it raise cholesterol levels? Well, to put these matters in perspective, I'm joined by the Professor of Clinical Biochemistry at the University of Surrey, Vincent Marks. Now, presumably, Vincent, coffee affects different people in different ways.
Yes, it does. Heavy drinkers have a different response than light drinkers. Different people get rid of it. I destroy it much more rapidly, or at least caffeine in the coffee. But there are big differences between people.
Any difference between instant and fresh coffee as far as caffeine is concerned?
The average instant coffee has about half as much caffeine per cup as home-brewed fresh coffee.
Because there was this scare some years ago that it was a contributory cause of cancer of the pancreas.
Indeed there was, and further work showed that to be nonsense. It's been considered to be a cause of arterial disease, and there's no evidence to support that. Of psychiatric disease, there isn't any support for that. It does cause, in a very small number of people, an anxiety state, and in an even smaller number of people, irregularities of the heart.
Yes, I mean, it is a stimulant. Could it give you palpitations? I mean, what sort of people would get palpitations?
It can indeed, and I think that this is something that should be borne in mind, and certainly in my own clinical practice, I take a history in which I find out if people take caffeinated beverages, coffee, tea, and even cola drinks, although they're not very important. And then we measure the plasma caffeine, because that's the most important thing of all. If you want to really put it at the door of caffeine, the thing to do is to measure the caffeine.
What about cholesterol? Does it raise cholesterol
There is no
levels?
serious evidence that I am prepared to accept that coffee does. There might be something in certain brands of coffee. And in fact, the interesting thing is that coffee also contains substances known as chlorogenic acids, which have actually been used to bring down the cholesterol.
And then, of course, there are people who say, oh, no, I mustn't have any coffee, I won't be able to sleep. Does it cause insomnia?
I think that that is a genuine complaint in some individuals. Caffeine is a stimulant and does keep people awake. It makes you more alert, and that's a desirable feature. And if you are a slow metabolizer, that is, you destroy the caffeine slowly, you might well find difficulty in getting to sleep. So that a good cup of coffee containing quite a lot of caffeine might keep certain people awake.
Do you see any top limit to the number of cups of, let's take instant coffee you should have in the course of a day?
Well, I think that anybody who's drinking more than 10 cups of instant coffee, which would give them 500 milligrams of caffeine, is pushing it a bit hard. And I think that they probably ought not to go above 10 cups of tea or coffee. But I'm most interested in a few individuals who actually do say that they are sensitive to coffee and tea. They might well be. There are a few individuals who don't destroy the caffeine that it contains normally, and they are really worth finding out, because you can do something for them, even though they're not taking excessive amounts.
It would be, I think, rather negative. What does coffee do for you that's good,
well,
apart from tasting nice?
That's very important. What's wrong with it tasting nice? Without caffeinated beverages, i.e. tea and coffee, what would we drink? What we used to drink before 1650, which was beer. You know, well, I think that coffee and tea taste good, and they're probably as good for you as any beverage that you can drink.
Well, my guest in today's programme was Professor Vincent Marks. Thank you very much indeed. Now, if you've been worried about the dire effects of coffee, let me leave you with Voltaire's valediction. I have been poisoning myself with coffee for more than 80 years, he said, and I'm still not dead. I must say, as far as I'm concerned, more power to the delicate red berries, and may God bless all who pick them.
Yes, all things in common, all people one. They came in peace, the orders came to cut them down. Ye diggers all stand up for glory, stand up now.
It's beautiful.
A funny noise. The food programme was presented by Derek Cooper. The producer was Vanessa Harrison.